and welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel if you are new. Today I'm trying to be festive, but I just don't know if it's really working out for me. Anyways, today I am going to be doing my super late November wrap-up. I've been putting off filming this video because November was just a really weird reading month. I ended up reading 9 books, so like as far as quantity goes, it was a good reading month, but every single book that I read except for 2 was 3 stars or under, so quality-wise, it wasn't that good. But then also there was one book that was a 5-star read, which also might be my favorite read of the year, so it was all just kind of all over the place. And yeah, I've been putting it off basically because I have a lot of mediocre books to talk to you about. So as per usual, we're just going to jump into the statistics. So starting off, as I said, I read 9 books in November. I read approximately 1,978 pages. 2 of the books were contemporary romances, 1 was a fantasy, 1 was historical fiction, 3 were horror, and 2 were thrillers. I had 1 1.5-star read, 3 2 stars, 3 3 stars, 1 3.5 star, and then 1 5-star read. 3 of the books were ebooks and 6 of them were physical, and then I read 3 adults, 3 middle grades, and 3 YAs. So it was nice and even across the board there. As per usual, I also like to go over the years that the books were released. So we have a 2018, 2017, 2018, 2018, 1981, 1984, 1991, 2018, 2018. So a lot of 2018s and then some older books from the 80s and 90s, which we will get into when I get to those. And those are also the ebooks, because that's also pretty rare for me to read a lot of ebooks, but like I said, we'll get to that when we get to them. Anyways, I'm just prolonging the inevitable. I don't really want to talk about these books because I didn't really super enjoy a lot of them, and a lot of my thoughts are just going to be meh. So, starting off with the first book I read, which was An Unwanted Guest by Sherry LaPena. This book is set in upstate New York, the Catskills specifically, I believe, which I have been to before, and it's very much like a in the middle of the country, surrounded by woods kind of area. So we follow quite a big cast of characters as they are staying at this inn or hotel, and they end up getting stranded there because of the snow. But then they end up finding one of the guests dead under rather suspicious circumstances. So this book has very much been compared to kind of like Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None, and that was really what made me want to pick it up. But also I've read quite a few of Sherry LaPena's other books, and one of them I enjoyed, one of them I really loved, and those are the only other 2 I've read. But yeah, so because I really liked the other one, I really wanted to love this book, and because it's been compared to Agatha Christie, I also really wanted to love this book, but unfortunately, it just didn't really do it for me. I ended up giving it a 3.5 stars, like I can't even remember, I have to keep referring back to my notes. But yeah, so it wasn't a bad book by any means, but it just didn't do what I wanted it to do. I think my biggest issue with this book was that it took a really long time to kind of get into the main plot, and I think that's because we followed such a big cast of characters. The first like 100 pages was basically just introducing us to each one of the characters, and so it just took a lot longer to get into the story than I would have preferred. It also wasn't a super memorable book for me, as you can tell because I have to keep looking back at my notes. Like, I can kind of remember like who it was at the end, but I don't remember a motive. I don't remember any of the characters' name except for 1 character and maybe 2. I feel like it sounds like I'm really hating on this book, but I did give it 3.5 stars. So like in the moment I did enjoy it. It did kind of have that Agatha Christie feel to it, like a classic kind of whodunit mystery, but it just, like I said, it wasn't super memorable. It just took a bit too long to get into, and yeah, so I gave it 3.5 stars. I would still recommend it because I think a lot of people liked it a lot better than I did. It was probably just maybe the time that I was reading it. Maybe I wasn't really in the mood for it. I don't know. But moving on to the next book, we have another thriller, and that is Behind Her Eyes by Sarah Pinborough. This book is another one that is just all over the place. I don't even know really how to explain the plot of this book. Basically, we follow a girl whose name I've forgotten. It's Louise, and she is a single mom, and she ends up like going out to a bar or something and like hooking up with this guy, sort of, but then she ends up going to work the next day and she's got a new boss, and guess who that new boss is? The guy she hooked up with the night before, and he's also married. So then she ends up kind of befriending his wife, or his wife kind of ends up befriending her, and so she's in this awkward place where she doesn't want the wife to know that she like kissed her husband and she doesn't want the husband to know that she's friends with his wife and yada yada yada, all this kinds of drama, but there is this whole other thrillery element to it. So basically, as far as my thoughts on this book, let's see, what did I even rate it? I don't remember. I gave it 3 stars. So I liked this book mostly because of the last half of it. I honestly almost DNF'd this book because it was very much just a lot of that kind of drama. There wasn't a whole lot of thrilleriness happening. It was just a lot of drama, and I wasn't really here for it. But every single review I read, someone is snow blowing outside, and that's going to be really annoying for the background of my video, so I'm sorry about that if you can hear that. But every single review I read of this book was always about the ending of the story. It was like the ending of the story was super shocking. So I wanted to DNF it, but I also wanted to know what the ending was. So I am glad I read it till the end because the ending was the only reason that I gave it 3 stars. Otherwise, I probably would have given it 1 star. But at the same time, was the ending shocking? Yes. Was it believable? I don't really know. But without giving too much away, there was this very specific thing that happened at the end that basically like fueled the rest of the ending. Like you couldn't have the ending without that thing, and it was that thing that I didn't really find believable, because there are some shocking endings that are like really good, and then there are some shocking endings that are like, this is just here for shock value. Like the author is like, what's the most crazy thing I could make happen, and that is the thing. And yeah, I just didn't find it super believable, but the last like 100 pages of the book were pretty thrillery, and like I said, I didn't predict it, so I guess I have to give it a little credit with that. But yeah, overall it's another book that I'm just like, I don't really know what my thoughts are on it because it was just kind of all over the place. So the next book I ended up picking up was Bright We Burn by Kiersten White. This is the 3rd and final book in the Conquerors saga, I think is what its official series name is, but I call it the End I Darken trilogy because I've never heard anyone else refer to it as the Conqueror saga. Basically, this trilogy is the story of Vlad the Impaler, but a gender-bend version where he is a woman. So I read the first 2 books in the series, and I think I ended up giving them 4 stars. I read them like a couple months ago, and I was honestly a little bit nervous going into this book because my memory is really bad with books, and I really could not recall anything that happened in the second book. So I thought I was going to go into this book being super confused, and I honestly wasn't even sure if I was going to end up finishing it, but alas, I gave this book 5 out of 5 stars, and it is possibly my favorite book that I read this year. I did not realize how attached to these characters I was until reading this book, because they didn't all get through this story okay, and that really hurt me. But also, I honestly didn't remember a whole lot that happened in the second book, but that didn't matter at all because I just went into this book and was completely into it, even though I couldn't really remember what had been happening before. And I also have to say, I've never been so invested in like the politics of a story before, because this series definitely focuses more on like the war and politics of a story than I would usually be into, but I was super invested in this. I was super invested in the characters. I just really enjoyed it, and I would 100% recommend this to everybody. So the next book I ended up picking up was October Kiss by Kristen Etheridge. As you can tell, I was a little late to the game with reading this book since I read it in November instead of October, but better late than never, I guess. This book is based on a Hallmark Channel movie. So in this book we follow a girl called Poppy, and she is having a hard time just like fitting in life and finding a job that she's really into, so she ends up getting a temporary position as a nanny for this guy who's like a recently single dad, and he's like a web app developer, and so he's really busy with his work and can't spend as much time with his kids. But then Poppy feels like she's starting to finally fit in with this family, and yeah, it's a pretty cheesy story. I should have known that I was setting myself up for failure with picking this book up because it's based on a Hallmark movie, and I have maybe seen 2 Hallmark movies in my entire life, and they're just not the movie for me. I just can't handle that kind of cheesiness, but I thought I can like borderline handle Hallmark movies and also borderline enjoy them in book form. And I guess the difference between this kind of book and like a regular adult contemporary romance book that I would usually read is that with these books the writing is really bad. Like, no offense, but I can handle and really enjoy like adult contemporary romances. But with this book, it was just that the writing was bad, the characters weren't very good, the plot was barely there, and yeah, it's just not a good story. So I gave it 1.5 stars because I didn't completely hate it, but I would also not recommend it to anyone. So that's that. Moving on. So the next book that I read was Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, Volume 1, and this was one of the ebooks that I read this month because it was super, super short, and so I could kind of handle it in ebook form, but otherwise ebooks usually give me a headache, so I had to really take this one in like small doses. So yeah, I ended up giving this book 3 out of 5 stars. This is a middle grade book. It's like a collection of horror stories, and I feel like I'm the only person who didn't read these books when I was a kid, and I think that's probably the reason I didn't enjoy this as much as a lot of other people have, because, you know, I would have, had I read it as a kid, I would have had all the kind of nostalgic feels to it. That being said, I also didn't completely dislike the story. With this book, my favorite thing about it by far were the illustrations, which were honestly borderline terrifying. Like, if I was reading this book when I was a kid, I'm pretty sure the illustrations would have terrified me. So those were my favorite part of the whole thing. But there were also like 50% of the stories were actually pretty clever, and then there was another 50% of the stories that were just kind of silly or really just strange, and they didn't make a lot of sense, or they didn't end at all, and it was just kind of weird. And there was also an element of all of these books, because I ended up reading volume 2 and 3, we'll get to that in a second, but there's also this element of the books where it was randomly like the author was teaching a kid how to tell these stories. So it, like, right at the end it would be like, and now scream and grab your friend. And that was just really jarring every time one of those happened, because I just didn't understand it, and it was just like randomly scattered throughout. But like I said, I did really enjoy the illustrations, and like 50% of the stories were actually kind of clever, so I gave it 3 stars, and I ended up moving on to volume 2, which I ended up giving 2 stars. I didn't like this one quite as much. The illustrations were still really good, and there were still a few stories that I did enjoy, but not as many, so that's why I rated it a little bit lower. Oh my gosh, why are you snow blowing right now? Oh my gosh, guys, I'm sorry about all the loud noises happening outside, but I guess it's just that time of year. So then I moved on to volume 3, which actually had a different title. It's called like More Tales to Chill Your Bones is what it was called. And this one I also gave 2 stars, and it was basically the same thing with the last one. I loved the illustrations, I loved some of the stories, but a lot less, so I gave it 2 stars. The next book that I picked up in November was 5 Feet Apart, and this is a pretty popular story at the moment. It actually won one of the Goodreads awards categories. I can't remember which one, but it won one of them, and it was recently turned into a movie, which is why I decided to pick it up. So in this book we follow 2 teenagers called Stella and Will, and they are both patients in a hospital because they both have cystic fibrosis, and they end up kind of forming a friendship, and it turns into a little bit more than that, but because of what they have, they can't get within 6 feet of one another. So like I said, this was recently turned into a movie, which is why I ended up picking this up, because when I first heard about this, I immediately thought of The Fault in Our Stars, which is a book and movie that I didn't really like at all, which is a very unpopular opinion, but Cole Sprouse is in this movie, and I'm a pretty big fan of his, so I wanted to watch the movie, but I wanted to read the book first. Unfortunately, I ended up giving this book 2 stars as well. In my opinion, this book wasn't that well written, and it's told in alternating perspectives from Stella and Will, and Stella was like borderline a really dislikable character, and there were some moments where I was just like, girl, you need to just mind your own business, because she had some control problems, which I guess is like part of the plot of the story, is because she doesn't have like control of her lungs, she wants to have control of everything else. So like I understand that, but also it was kind of really irritating. The only reason I did actually continue on reading this book and actually read it until the end was because I enjoyed Will's character, and I much preferred his chapters when I was reading this book. But also the storyline wasn't super interesting. It was kind of cheesy, which I guess I probably should have expected, but there were also certain elements of the story which, because I don't have, like, I don't really know what they're going through in this story, I feel like I can't really speak on it, but there were some points where I felt like the storyline was borderline a little bit problematic, which is a word I don't like to say because it's used so often and I feel like we've lost all sense of the definition at this point. But yeah, overall didn't really like this story, and I honestly don't know if I'll even watch the movie at this point, but maybe the movie is better. If you've seen it, let me know. And the final book that I read in November was Beneath the Sugar Sky by Seanan McGuire. This is the third book in the Wayward Children series, which is a young adult series about kids that like go to other worlds like Wonderland or Narnia, and then they end up coming back and find it quite difficult to settle back into the actual world. So this is the third book in the series. If you don't know the way that the series is kind of set up, a lot of the books are like prequels and sequels, and you don't really have to read all them in order, or you don't even have to read some to read others, if that makes sense. So this was a sequel to the first one, but the second one was a prequel to the first one. It's all a little bit confusing, but basically I really enjoyed the first one. I didn't really enjoy the second one like at all, but this one was actually pretty good. I didn't enjoy it as much as the first one, but I definitely enjoyed it a lot better than the second one. So I ended up settling on a 3-star rating for this book. My favorite thing about Seanan McGuire's writing are her characters. I just love all of her characters, and I think she writes them really well. I think the issue that I've had with the second book, and the reason I didn't give this book a higher rating, is because the second and third book were both mostly set in one of those like magical worlds, whereas the first one was just set in our world, and it was more of like this murder mystery, and I think that's what I really enjoyed about it. I don't know how much I love the kind of world building that she does, and I think that's why I can never really get into these more fantastical worlds that she has in her story, because I just don't know if the world building works for me. But that being said, like I said, I really love her characters, and so I gave this one 3 stars because I really loved the characters in here, and I definitely plan on picking up the 4th and 5th book in the series. So yeah, those were all of the books that I read in November. I'm sorry if this video was very much all over the place and I kept looking over there, but I had to keep referring back to my notes because honestly it's like the middle of December at this point and I've forgotten a lot about all of those books. So yeah, I'm sorry if it was all over the place. As per usual, please leave me a comment down below and let me know if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them. I would love to discuss them with you in the comments. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in my next one. Bye!
You hear that, Samson?